the night in life and afterlife. My name is Henrike Lehnemann. I'm Professor of Medieval German Literature and Linguistics and one of the directors of the Oxford Medieval Studies Programme, one of the largest forums in the world for interdisciplinary research on the Middle Ages, which brings together over 200 academics and a large body of graduate students. The programme is part of TORCH, the Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities, and we are hugely grateful to them for hosting our end-of-term interdisciplinary lecture, and for being so flexible as to upgrade the hosting platform to allow for a far greater number of audience members than we had hoped and expected. Thanks, Nikki, Justine, and Holly. The appeal of the lecture is certainly due to the topic and our speaker today, Dr. Tobias Capwell. Before I introduce him, a few housekeeping announcements and thanks. You will have seen that on the right-hand side, there is a chat function. This provides you with the opportunity to raise questions and post comments already during the talk. And the earlier you get in, the more likely it is that your question can be asked. My co-director, Professor Francis Lennigan, will pick up these questions after the talk for the Q&A session. At the same time, there's also the opportunity to tweet under the hashtag of Armour, and Dr. Karl Kinsella, our communications officer, will pick up these questions and also post them afterwards. A third way to get involved is to go to our website on Torch, which you will see in the chat box, Torch or XAC UK Medieval Studies, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter and can send us a message. And there will be a report about the event provided, thankfully, by our master students from the MST in Medieval Studies. If you want to comment on that, please come in. But now over to Dr. Tobias Capwell, who normally is the curator of arms and armour at the Wallace Collection in London, one of the largest collections for armour in the world. And currently he is on furlough, as many of our colleagues in the museums and heritage sector are, but has very kindly agreed to come in and talk about his own research and especially about his forthcoming book. You'll hear a bit about that at the end of the talk. He is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries and an internationally acknowledged art historian and expert on medieval and Renaissance weapons. Currently, he is completing this book, Armour of the English Knight, 1450 to 1500. It's actually the second in a series of three books. The first book already came out in 2015. His other books include Henry Moore, The Helmet Heads, which came out in 2019, Arms and Armour of the Medieval Joust, and Armour of the English Knight, as mentioned in 2015. Then The Noble Art of the Sword, Fashion and Fencing in Renaissance Europe, 1520 to 1630. And Masterpieces of the European Arms and Armour at the Wallace Collection in 2011. And we very much hope that we'll be soon able to see you again there and get a guided tour in person through this fabulous collection. Until then, we are very grateful having you here. Over to you, Tobias.
Thank you so much. As well as all of that, the very generous notes, I have to confess that as well as a researcher and as someone who's passionate about my subject, I also am something of an evangelist. I just ended up doing what I do rather than religion, but some of the same impulses are there. And whenever I find out, I immediately want to tell everyone about it. And that helps with the motivations for getting things published. But it also means that when you're working in a specialist subject like mine that can seem somewhat niche to the broader tapestry of history and culture and art and everything else, you can spend a lot of time in your own little corner. And it's very important for people doing things like this to get out and talk to people working in related fields and really be an advocate, if not indeed an evangelist, for their own little part of it. And to think very hard about, why does what I do matter? I'm interested in it for my own strange reasons, but how could it be useful to other people working on other things? And why is it interesting anyway? Why should we care about medieval armor? I think it's important that when you're working in a specialist field, you give some consideration to those basic questions every now and again, and do some soul searching and so forth. I've one of the many things that I'm struck by in regard to armor is how it seems very technical and very specific, and yet it has a potentially huge impact on how we look at all kinds of other things and how it relates to other things, some of which is fairly and pretty obvious, military technology, heraldry or whatever, but there's a lot that's perhaps not quite so immediately obvious or intuitive. So, with my evangelistic hat on, I thought I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been thinking about recently and the different ways we can look at this subject. There are the direct approaches and the perhaps more interesting scenic approaches. And I thought we'd go over some of that. And then I also want to share a few of the interesting things that have been coming up in my work more recently, and get into some of the really nitty-gritty little details of the work. Because of course, the meaning, the real meaning, the truth, the enlightenment is all to be found in the fine detail, ultimately. So we'll see where we get. I want this to be useful to people, potentially working on all kinds of things. But I also just, have to retain my own remit and talk about what I'm qualified. So as well as a professional person working in this field, I've also been a practitioner of martial arts and armored combat and horsemanship. That's another lecture and another story, but it's important. It's a thing that's important to know about me, because the work as a practitioner, as an experimental investigator, if you will, has a lot to offer more traditional academic work, and that's how I have worked. And I come to my subject from the point of view of a user of armor, as a martial artist, as a horseman, a practitioner, as well as an academic specialist. And this work can get you into some strange situations, but those situations can then be very thought-provoking and lead you in all kinds of strange directions. So, for example, some of you might just remember this day in 2015. This is the reburial of the earthly remains of Richard III, as you probably know. This is me here with my horse Duke, and my colleague Dominic Sewell and I are leading the procession through Leicester City Centre, which is at this point crammed with about 80,000 people. Those were the days, eh? Now, here they have barricades, and it looks reasonably well controlled and safe, but most of the time there wasn't much in the way of a barricade. It was all very intimate. And, we didn't have time to stop and think about this. We had to pay attention to what was going on in the moment. It was what the American military might call a hazard-rich environment. And, but occasionally, as you're as put yourself in my position, going through this strange situation. Occasionally, I did have a chance to look around and see the the reactions on people's faces, and it was really remarkable. There were people bursting into tears when we came around the corner, when they saw us, when they saw this image of these armored horsemen. And that seemed remarkable to me as a medievalist, because you don't necessarily expect a modern person to have that kind of visceral reaction to what might seem to be a rather antiquated and uh, uh, old, irrelevant image. And yet it's not. So these are things I've been thinking about before this particular moment. But this day did make me go back and think a lot more about what is it about armor? Of course, it's practical, functional equipment. And it's for fighting. It's there to stop this person getting killed by swords and axes and arrows and all sorts of things. It has a very practical, functional job to do, which is self-evident. But it's so much more than that. You don't usually burst into tears when you see a car. I guess maybe some cars perhaps might have that impression on some people. But you know what I mean. We have to understand armor on the technical level, but it's an aesthetic entity as well. It has great expressive power that works on all kinds of levels. The technical and the aesthetic, the technological and the artistic, those two aspects are fundamentally intertwined, and you always got to think about this subject on both of those levels at the same time. Now, back to my own thoughts and think about, why am I interested in this? Why, after years and years of working on it, do I want to keep working on it? I spend a lot of my life in an art museum, and that's a big part of my professional approach to this subject. I have to think about it as art. I mean, armor is clearly art. It's expressive art, it's decorative art, but it actually taps into some pretty old primal human stuff that I think is quite interesting. The human impulse to decorate the body, to make the body the artwork, if you will, is as old as we are, basically. I mean, here, Otzi the Iceman, 30 or more thousand years old, comes out of his glacier, and we find that he's covered in tattoos, over 60 tattoos and now they're quite unusual tattoos, and they seem strangely technical, and some people think they have some kind of medical or a relation to acupuncture points or something. I don't know, but I'm not qualified. But let's just take it as rote that tattooing the body. And here's a nice ancient Egyptian ladies' tattoos. A lot of tattooing has come up just with recent CT scanning of ancient Egyptian mummies, incidentally. This drive not to paint the wall of a building or a cave or whatever, but to paint or to ornament the body, to make the body a work of art that is then expressive of identity and social position and everything else, is very, very old. And armor is part of that impulse. It's a development of that very, very early human drive. And then, there's something something special about sculpture. The earliest, as far as we know at the moment, the earliest human is a sculpture. You know, painting. Are we okay, everybody? Yep, looks like we're okay. We're back. So there's an impulse to create, to take an idea and create it in 3 dimensions. Those things at once, sculpture and its body art. And so it's really just, I just mentioned that as a way of stressing that when we get to the medieval armor, it's just a development of something much older that can be all kinds of other ways. Once you get, of course, to the ancient Greeks, you know, it's sort of obvious that you're dealing with sculpture and you're dealing with body art. Ancient Greek and some ancient Roman armor, of course, plays very much with the relationship, the duality between a naked body and a protected one, and a very heavily armored body that appears naked is a fascinating idea. But very quickly, when you're dealing with metal plates being sculpted for the body, you find that you are dealing with an art form that is defined very much by the human form, but it's not limited by it.
Apologies, Tobias.
Yeah.
You have to share your screen again, please.
Oh, sorry.
It went down in
did
between.
We have some kind of a, okay, sorry, everybody. Oh, God. See, in the Middle Ages, we wouldn't have this problem. We'd be in a room together, wouldn't we? Oh, God. Bear with me, folks. Share the screen again. All of that, all my controls are gone. Sorry. There we go. Hang on. All right.
Great. It's back.
Okay.
Just do from this slide, please.
Yeah, here we are. Yeah. This is where we were. So we're talking about the ancient Greeks. We were talking about the transcendence of the human form. You have to make the armor work with the human body. It's defined by the human body, but it's not limited. You can go beyond it. So you see a lot of non-anatomical decoration and sculptural form working into some of the earliest plate armor. The plasticity of metal allows that that sculpture to continue. And at the same time, of course, even as we approach the Middle Ages, by way of the classical world, there's still some pretty basic human primal feeling going on. You know, we can't escape the fact that in a more natural setting, there are beings who are more powerful than us. Even at a zoo, when you encounter a lion, the lion has a presence that is derived from its strength and its physical superiority to you. And you know, human beings, of course, have always been very sensitive to that. We don't like feeling weak and disempowered. Who does? We want that power for ourselves. We want to find a way of taking the lion's power or associate ourselves with it in some way. So, of course, and again, I guess one of my key points tonight is all of the expressive, the aesthetic elements of this come back to the real visceral reality. There's a kind of literalism to this. A warrior in armor claims to be superior to other human beings, but he is superior to other human beings in certain respects. His equipment makes him superior. His fighting, martial training makes him superior. And the obvious way to become superior over a lion and to tell everyone about it is to kill the lion and wear its skin. And that wearing of the attributes of the thing that you want to associate yourself, or the thing that you want to be superior to, is again just about as old as we are. Heracles and the Nemean lion is probably a development of real people killing bears for very basic reasons. You need a coat so you don't freeze. But as soon as you're wearing a bear skin, it says quite a lot about you. The expressive, the artistic power grows out of the practical necessities and elaborates continually. By the Middle Ages, those associations are still there, although they often have become much more stylized. The lion is still there on this early 14th century knight's armor. He's not claiming to wear a lion's pelt as such, but the image is often good enough to convey the essence of the message. And of course, leave it to the Renaissance to take that to its extreme. And by the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you have thousands of years of culture and visual references to build on. An armor like this, made probably for King Henry II of France, has a Herculean association, perhaps, or it's hard not to see it that way, but that's certainly not the only way to read it. Now, beyond lions, of course, so that we can associate ourselves with them. We can imagine ourselves taking on their role. There's a mammalian commonality. But of course, there are other creatures in the world who are less like us, and that feel powerful, seem to be powerful, seem to be empowered, and that we want to associate ourselves with in other ways. The reptile, for example, this is one extraordinary object in the British Museum, the Roman crocodile skin armor, probably for parade, but extraordinary, literal acquiring of the power or the aspect of another creature. And that's an important theme when you look at later medieval and Renaissance art too. Artists are sensitive to this in different ways. This is St. George by Carlo Crivelli, who did a number of very extraordinary depictions of St. George. And he's clearly fascinated not only by traditional heroic imagery, the lion masks are there, but his St. George also tends to be very reptilian. There's again that sense that the victor takes on the attributes of his enemy or the thing that he vanquishes. And that carries on right through. At the Wallace Collection, there's a fascinating fragment of a dragon armor. Crocodiles very quickly turn themselves into dragons, I suppose. And this is all that survives of a complete head to foot dragon armor. Now, another general point about armor that's a good guideline right across the subject is don't convince yourself that just because something is beautiful or ornate or sculptural, it must therefore be ceremonial and non-functional. This is something that people do now instinctively, automatically, because we want to make distinctions between functional objects and artistic objects. Modern people often don't want to allow for the fact that a work of art can also be a practical object, but they certainly are in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance. And this fragment of this dragon armor, almost crocodile armor, has been heat treated. to harden and temper it, which is only something you really do for functional armor that's intended for fighting. Um, there is such a thing as non-functional armor, but it's really a tiny minority of the subject because of that literalism of the situation. You know, the meaning, the power of this, it derives from the act. If you don't fight in it, if you don't walk the walk, you don't get any of the other benefits of status, artistic impact, whatever. And you know, you see this developing, and the relationship between armor and all of this other sculptural expression is very old. There's Alexander and his lion helmet, which again also evokes Heracles. And there are, you know, kinds of animal associations or power associations that work into armor in all kinds of different ways, and, you know, according to different belief systems. Sometimes it's the boar that is the image or animal of power. I didn't necessarily think of animals so readily with the very wonderful Vendel 14 helmet, which is now in Stockholm. But when you see this helmet in the flesh with these extraordinary plates, the curved label-like plates on the back and the whole shape of the front, my imagination immediately jumped to the evocation of a sea eagle. This is it looks very much like a bird of prey or a raptor. And am I just making that up, or is it intentional? And if it happens so readily, is it just me? Sometimes it's hard to say. Nevertheless, it works. You don't need to know how it works for it to work on you. So how does all this old Neolithic pre-Christian work when we get to the Christian knights of the Middle Ages? It's not necessarily quite so acceptable to a traditional Christian orientation. However, it's still there. It's couched in different language there, and it still works through the equipment. One of the things that I've been pondering recently and very interested in is that's written about by one of my favorite chivalric authors, a fellow named Guittieri de Games, who was a Castilian knight in the service of a nobleman named Peronino, the Count of Buelna. And he wrote a kind of, some of you probably already know this, but Guittieri de Games wrote a kind of heroic biography of his master called El Vittorial. And in the introduction, he's laying out, you know, his perspectives on things. And he talks about chivalry as in a way that made me think of the old idea of the feudal pyramid, you know, with the king at the top and his knights and noblemen and peasants and laborers at the bottom. And he kind of evokes the idea of a pyramid of chivalry that is just, you know, the realm of the chivalric classes. Let's forget about everybody else. But at the top of that pyramid is God himself. And then the power of God kind of filters down through first heavenly or celestial orders of knighthood down to the earthly realm. So at the top, of course, the first order are the warrior angels, most notably Saint Michael, the leader. Then he tells us that the next tier down are the warrior saints or the martyrs, humans who have been elevated to work as on behalf of the rest of us as intermediaries between the earth and the divine. And then there are the third level down. We only at that point do we enter our world with the kings of the earth, who are the earthly wielders of that divine power. Now that's the divine right of kings, of course, and to rule on the basis of the claim that you have been chosen by God and you are the wielder of divine power and everyone else should just accept that. is it's a pretty big ask. And medieval people never expected that to just be accepted. It had to be proved. Kings had to prove, knights, the whole chivalric apparatus needed to prove that this was reality and not just their own idea. Um, and armor is one of the absolute fundamental tools in that system of proving these claims, that the aristocracy is a special group of people separated from the rest of humanity to wield special power and rule in that way. Kings, one of the best ways that king can prove it, of course, is on the bodies of their enemies, to lead their armies personally in battle. A royal army with the king himself at its head always has an extraordinary advantage over one that does not. Now, medieval historians can argue about how often they win or not, but it's an extraordinary thing to have one's leader in the front line. If you're going to ask men to die, you have to go with them, and you have to be seen to go with them, and you have to make yourself look as much like that source of divine power as possible. And this is what the armor does. Another one of my sort of side interests is fully gilded armor, and the way very, very extraordinarily rich armor decoration was used to visually prove all of these claims. It's right there in the real world, and you can see it. When you see a king or a Burgundian duke in his fully gilded armor, he's like the sun manifesting in human form. This is as close to God on earth as anybody is likely to see. And again, you see that is what is expected of a righteous king. And then, of course, that applies to everybody else as well. It filters on down. And this is useful, incidentally, to artists who need to tell stories and need to make individual characters obvious in sometimes quite complicated compositions. And that also tells us in turn a lot about the level of technology of armor and who was wearing what at what time. For example, in this early 14th century English battle scene, this is a two-part illustration that is described as noble warfare, the warfare of aristocrats or knights, versus common warfare. We'll get to that in a minute. But here, the king, just as he would in reality, he's wearing the best equipment, very expensively decorated, gilded pieces, the crown, of course, on the helm. He's immediately obvious. He needs to be. People often ask me, isn't it dangerous to make yourself as the leader so obvious on a battlefield? Isn't that a bad idea? Well, not really. Because you don't have long-range sniper rifles in the 14th century. So even if you do know where the enemy king is some distance away, there's not a lot you can do about it, really. And anyway, the benefits of being seen as a leader with your men vastly outstrip any possible dangers, really. Although if you get killed as the king, the battle is, of course, over, and there are examples of that occurring. But you can also see some of the rest of the pecking order happening here. Very well-equipped knights, closely associated with the king in, friendly or otherwise ways, but equipped in different ways according to their status. King this is about 1320, already has quite a lot of plate armor, but his well-equipped knights have less at this stage. The artists observe their world and then use the material realities to tell their story. There, incidentally, is the common warfare. This is actually much more diverse than you might expect. These are common, people, but some of them are very well equipped. Some of them have steel helmets and bits, or iron or steel helmets and bits of plate armor. Others don't. There's some hardened, what appear to be hardened leather, skull caps, mail, lots of padded textile. But each one of these characters is diverse and different. It's lucky that artists were so interested in armor in the Middle Ages and so concerned to represent it, for the most part, as effectively and accurately as they could. Because, of course, one of the huge difficulties with this subject before really the 16th century, late 15th, 16th centuries, when you're interested in armor, is that there isn't really very much armor. There's the distinct lack of surviving equipment, and the lack grows the further back in the past you go. Certainly in the Middle Ages, so much of anybody's armor, really, aristocratic or common, it was in one way or another based on organic materials, leather, bone, textile, horn. And all of these materials, they don't survive well. They're not going to survive for hundreds of years unless they are preserved in extraordinary circumstances, very unlikely. So when you're interested in armor, as I am, you have to look at all kinds of other things. You can't depend on surviving objects. You have to look at visual art of all kinds. You have to look at the written sources and be very aware of the latest archaeology and what does survive in terms of material objects. But that's part of the fun. You're forced to work in an interdisciplinary way and collect lots of different kinds of evidence and try to use those sources of evidence in complementary ways. Now, as well as the general group associations, the associations of one's particular class, in the Middle Ages, because chivalry increasingly becomes such a profound cult of personality. The prowess of the individual increasingly becomes more and more important. That's probably one of the reasons, for example, why the joust, the one-on-one mounted contest with lances, becomes, in the 14th century, comes to supersede in precedence the old mass combat of the tournament. Because it focuses everyone's attention on the skills of the individual. There are plenty of situations, though, such as a battle, where the individual has to work quite hard to distinguish himself visually. And it really, and the ways that this was done, of course, heraldry is hugely important, separate lecture, but it really goes much beyond that. All parts of the equipment have to be as eye-catching, as distinctive, as individual as possible. And certainly in the Middle Ages, painted armor was hugely important. And of course, heraldry is used decoratively across all of the knight's equipment, but it goes beyond that into abstract ornament as well. By the late Middle Ages and the 15th century, things get very much more complicated, though, with the advent of full plate armor. There's a kind of an artistic sculptural unity to a full plate armor that isn't quite as present in the same way earlier. The armor becomes more than ever before a kind of hollow sculpture that is designed to contain the body of the wearer, the artist patron, and also indeed to kind of transform him into a living artwork, as well as a martial engine. And that sculptural quality increasingly becomes more and more important. And it's something the late medievalists really need to be aware of, that beauty and expressive power can grow out of the abstract form of the armor with no necessary need for any other decoration or imagery. Piero della Francesca's patron here, Federico da Montefeltro, is a very wealthy, powerful Italian nobleman. And yet his armor in this extraordinary altarpiece is entirely plain. There's no decoration on it at all. Apart from a very nice polish, which is important, the radiating light, that radiance, of course, and all of the divine associations that carries. He has a very nice cloth of gold cloak and gilded sword. I mean, nobody's mistaking his status here. There's no danger of that, but it's interesting that the armor is purely the polished steel. The Italians were probably more likely to have that kind of a quinine taste. Elsewhere in Western Europe, decoration is still, applied decoration is still enormously important. This is one of the Caesar tapestries created for the Dukes of Burgundy, or the Burgundian ducal court, in around late 1460s, 1470-ish. And again, this shows you the whole chivalric spectrum, from, lower ranking men at arms wearing old-fashioned equipment and only, partial plates, to completely armored but fairly modest men at arms, all the way through to the companions, in this case, of Alexander, wearing Burgundian clothing, with a lot of selective fire gilding and ornament on their equipment, all the way up to Alexander. He's actually really a Burgundian duke, Charles the Bold, masquerading as Alexander, with his fully gilded armor inlaid with precious stones and pearls. This is not made up by the artist. This is real. We have Charles the Bold's payments to his goldsmith to fully gild his armor and fret it with pearls and rubies and sapphires. That's another project that I worked on recently. So this scene here is a story from the conquests of Alexander the Great, but it's told in late medieval Burgundian terms, and it's very, very faithful to reality. There's a certain stylized finesse about it, but most of this is what you really could expect actual Burgundian knights and men-at-arms to look like. And the way it works is the same way that real armor works, when you need to tell precisely what the status, what the associations of a specific individual are. It's all there, written on the equipment, if you know the visual language. And that, again, that quest for accuracy and faithfulness and technical authenticity pervades the depiction in art, even into the fantastical realm. For example, the way a late medieval French artist imagines Amazons, it still has to have a visceral reality, a physical, functional plausibility to it. It can't necessarily just be anything made up off the top of someone's head. These Amazons, are believable, and their equipment works. They're armed as light horsemen, horsewomen. They're wearing light brigandines and light cuirasses, shoulder plates. They're shooting from horseback. There's even an adarga here, typical Iberian light cavalry shield. Lots of little. The ring of truth is everywhere, and when it is, you believe the story and you accept it as part of your culture, however fantastical. They've had to put, the artist has felt he needed to put the women in skirts just to make the point that they're women and they weren't cross-dressing. That's always the medieval problem with women in armor, is that it's cross-dressing. That's one of the things that Joan of Arc got in trouble for, of course. So it's they're playing a careful game here, straying into the realm of fantasy. But the best fantasy is always grounded in reality. So we've seen that this isn't just about the rich versus the poor, the bottom of the pile and the top. The community of armor-wearing warriors is very diverse. Not all of them were knights by any means. Most of them weren't. Most of the people fighting in full plate armor on battlefields of the late medieval period, for example, were not knights. When you start to look at the evidence, you start to see how that works itself out and how to recognize it. This is a document that I was working on for the third part of my Armour of the English Knight project. When you know all of that and you've been working on that, documents like this immediately make sense. This is actually an inventory of the London warehouse of a consortium of Italian merchants. And they have to submit to an inventory of everything in their warehouse. It's conducted in early 1441. And included in the contents of their warehouse are a number of armors, complete armors made in Italy for export, in this case to England. They're all prepaid. They all have little tags on them saying who they're for and when they were sold. And they record that in this list in the National Archives. And at the top, they have one that is being held for a knight, Sir John Cressy, very active in the later part of the 100 Years' War. He buys a complete armor for over £8, which is a fair amount of money. That's about as expensive as Italian imported armor into England ever got. Domestic-made English armors by the masters of the London Company, for example, were generally much more expensive than that. They tend to be 10 and even 20 pounds. It's quite a lot more. And the rest of these armors are not for knights, but they're very clearly complete Milanese armors. But they're all for squires. Only the last squire is named, Sir John Savile. He later became a knight. We know a fair amount about him, actually. But all of their armors are significantly less expensive than Sir John Cressy. So there's something special. His is a better armor. It's more expensive. How is it better? We can never know, but it's probably just better made. It's better finished. It's probably got a nicer polish. It probably has some decoration, that kind of thing. But you need all of that background to make sense of documents which sometimes give you only the bare bones. But what they give you is definitive, so they in turn will support the visual artistic investigation. That's this kind of thing is a lot of what I've been doing these days. And hey, presto, here is Sir John Cressy himself, or rather his funerary monument. This is a very rare case where someone who's mentioned in the documents buying armor is represented on an armored effigy that survives. This is a really nice one. It's an interesting one. He's wearing an Italian or Italianate body armor, cuirass, but the arms and legs are more in the English or Western European style. So there's certain vague inconsistencies in what he's wearing, but that, armor is like clothes. Very often parts were mixed and matched and worn in different ways. And this is a good way into from the living significance of armor to its relevance to death and to the afterlife and to funerary representation. Actually, it's for anyone interested in the history of armor. Funerary sculpture is fantastically important. It's one of the best sources of evidence that we have, actually. And if there were no effigies and no brasses, if for whatever, Christianity developed way and we never developed the concept of purgatory and intercessionary prayer and we never had this kind of funerary sculpture, we would know very much less about the history of armor and the way it can be dated. The importance of this medium can't really be overstated. You know, hundreds and hundreds of effigies survive all over Europe, thousands probably, and decade by decade they record the artistic and the technological state of armor and all of the knight's equipment, all of the ways that he wanted his prestige, his status, his identity to be recorded for posterity. And armor can really be dated like that, down to the decade. That's a really powerful tool if you're trying to date a work of art that involves armor imagery and you might not have very much else to go on. And if you're like me, a committed effigy hunter, looking for these things and tracking them down and going to see them is a real adventure. And it can take you to extraordinary places that you would never end up in otherwise, probably. And you see extraordinary works of art, not in a museum, not in a glass box, in something resembling their original context. Now, lots of effigies get moved around churches and they get broken and changed around, but still, it's quite extraordinary that, you know, in most countries in Europe, churches, all medieval churches all over in the countryside and in out of the way places still have all of this remarkable medieval art sitting there. And I've spent really the last 25 years studying funerary sculpture in England. It started as a PhD and then got completely out of control. You know, I finished my PhD and then I just kept working on it, never stopped, and I'm still working on it. This is interesting, just as a slight aside. This is a very sketchy map of the locations of key alabaster effigies of men in armor dating from the 15th century. And it's fascinating, actually, that there's a hot spot. There's a really strong cluster of them right around the alabaster quarries in the Derbyshire, Staffordshire border country. You know, if you don't have to pay the cross-country haulage, you can afford them. And they become rarer and more prestigious the further away you get from the source of the raw materials. And also, this is subtler, but it's there, that also the further and further you get away, the richer and richer the individuals are, and generally the more ornate their armor tends to become. So there's a relationship between what you see on a specific monument and the real economic and physical circumstances of its creation. So there's a lot in these things. Now, I mean, you can look at them in lots of different ways. Fundamentally, though, they are extraordinary life-size sculptures that include the very detailed technical representation of armor that no longer exists. And not only do you have this armor that is long lost in reality, you also have an image of the person inside and a whole sense of it in its original living context, which is remarkable. I love looking at armor in museums. I do it a lot, but you know, that's a shell in a glass box, totally dissociated, totally decontextualized. And so in some ways, looking at effigies can be a better way into the subject, certainly on that essential human level. And this has all kind of come out of my work simply to try and record them and then to analyze and publish them from the point of view of armor as both art and technology. Now, let's not forget that an effigy is not just a glorified tombstone. I mean, it does have that function in a way. It does also kind of take the physical place of a deceased person in the real material world. And it is also a dynastic move, you know, that effigies, they take territory in a church, and they over time, churches are converted often into kind of chivalric mausoleums, generation after generation of a family being represented. But first and foremost, an effigy, of course, is, as Nigel Saul has said, a spur for intercessionary prayer. You know, this is an engine for intercessionary prayer. This is therefore an art form that will literally save your soul. And a lot of its effectiveness is bound up with its artistic quality. How faithfully does it conjure an image of who this person was in life, or who they were to their society, who they were to their world, and who are you praying for and why? This is what the effigy does. If you have a good effigy, you might very well spend hundreds and hundreds of fewer years in purgatory. And so the technical accuracy of these things is not just abstract taste. It has a fundamental priority behind it. And that's very good for us when otherwise so much armor and material culture has been lost. I mean, you never stop marveling at the extraordinary detail and the lifelike qualities of the carving on these monuments. And they're incredibly subtle. Sometimes the carvers just are just showing off. This is the triple monument of Margaret Beaufort and her two Lancastrian husbands at Canterbury Cathedral. Everyone always goes to see the Black Prince at Canterbury and they forget all about this one, but this is a really extraordinary monument. And look at this. This is again carved in a single piece of alabaster. And yet the English carver has such control of his material that he's showing, this in life, this is a textile surcoat, probably a silk surcoat worn over the armor that carries the coat of arms of the individual. This is Thomas, Duke of Clarence, one of the younger brothers of King Henry V, who got himself killed at the Battle of Beaujeu in 1421. But the paint, the polychrome is all worn off, but this is meant to be textile, but it's carved in alabaster. And look what he's done here. He didn't need to place the edge of the surcoat over the sword hilt so that the sword pushes the textile up. He's just done that because he can, and because it goes that much further to blur the distinctions between the image and the reality. You know, a great effigy, when it's all colored up and brand new, there should be a moment when you're not sure if it's the real person or not. Certainly if the church doesn't have electric light, and you know, there's that funny moment where the depiction and the reality, the distinctions kind of blur a little bit. That's what great effigy carvers can really achieve. And you know, that again, that essential demand for verisimilitude is why effigies also kind of incidentally become a hugely important source of evidence for armor. Now, just before we, just in our last little time here, I want to give you a couple of really specific examples of just how far they go, just how far they're willing to go in the quest for that individual reality. This is the effigy surviving of Sir John Savile. This is the same John Savile, incidentally, who turned up in 1441 in that document earlier. He had a long and successful military career and only died in 1482. And here he is. Now, this is an extraordinary alabaster monument in Thornhill in Yorkshire. A very nice example of a Flemish or an English or Western European armor. probably English. And this one is extraordinary in the detail. I want to focus your attention here just on the straps on the lower cuirass there. If you look at the straps overall across most of the effigy, they all have these wonderful little strap ends with these little pendant rings. These are little loose, dangly pendant rings that just give the armor a little bit more sparkle, I suppose. And we have such things surviving. They've been found in London. They're in the Museum of London. It's an English taste. But then you have one random strap on this armor that is not, the pendant is not a ring. It's a little multifaceted polygon. And then you've got that one, and there's another individual random one that has a little triangular pendant. It's very odd little inconsistency. Here's another one up in Cumbria. This is a drawing of the cuirass typology from my book, the first part of the English Knight project. On the effigy now, we're focusing on this area. You can see at this period, they have these little side straps connecting the upper and lower body armor. So you've got two straps kind of sitting side by side. That's what you're looking at here. Now, again, most of them match, and they have, recognizable, decoration, this little cross-hatched decoration on the strap ends. But then if you look at the other side, these straps don't match each other, and they don't match anything else on the armor. They're, again, completely random things, and you have to wonder, why is the artist doing this? He could just as easily carve everything to match. Why is it important that there are these funny little idiosyncrasies? This is one of my favorite examples in Aston. It's now in Birmingham. Didn't used to be, I suppose. This is an effigy that Thomas Erdington made long after, about a generation after this individual died. Lots of fun things on this armor. Again, lion masks on the gauntlets. And the hinges. Let's look at the hinges on the legs for a second. If you see here, you've got a front plate and a rear plate enclosing the lower leg. And those two plates are attached with a hinge. And this hinge has two rivets on the front and one at the back. So that the hinge can move a little bit, but not too much. That's how the armor is put together. Except on the other side, there's one mismatched hinge apart from the rest of the armor. It's just a plain oblong hinge. That's kind of strange, isn't it? But we find the answer to what's going on there if we go here. This is Coburg Castle in the Italian Tyrol, and it contains its ancestral medieval armory. It's probably the only place in the world that still does. And there it is, quite a glorious place. Now, I've been there a couple of times. It's the Mecca for people interested in armor. And if we concentrate on this armor here, made in the late 15th century, we notice that he has most of his hinges match the effigy, two rivets at the front and one at the back and decorated. But he also has one of these random hinges. It's a repair. Or maybe it's just an armorer's mistake. If you look at the inside of this plate on the real armor, there are two holes intended for one of these hinges, but he's put them too close to the plate, or something funny's happened and he's had to just change what he's doing and put something different on. That's the reality of real armor. Real armor gets messed up. The armorer makes a mistake or has to change something. It gets damaged and repaired in battle. It gets adjusted over time or changed around. But I think it's fascinating that that's all reflected on the effigies again. It really strengthens this connection that the funerary art, the images for the afterlife, reflect very faithfully the visceral, practical, literal reality of these people's lives down to the nitty-gritty of hinges and rivets. And for my work overall, it's meant that you can trace the whole technical and artistic history of armor in England through these monuments. And of course, you have to supplement it with all kinds of other evidence. But no English armor survives, pretty much none at all. So this is what we have to work with. We have to work with this creatively and in an interdisciplinary way to bring out, every level of meaning that it might have. Once you have built your technical blueprints of real armors that you can build that will function in the real world from the effigies, you find that they create a complete evolution, which matches up decade by decade with the kinds of innovations that are occurring elsewhere in Europe. So some of that work was published in this book, which is already available. Links below, etc. There's not very many of them left. It's been out for a few years, so if you want one, you better get one soon. The lockdown, for the lack of a better word, I'm sorry for that word, but that's what we have to work with. As an American, I feel like I have to apologize for words like that. But I had nothing because I'm on furlough from the museum. I've been working much more on this project, and we're pretty close to seeing the publication of this, despite the impediments of the lockdown and so forth. So watch out for it. I hope this has been interesting. I hope it's been thought-provoking. My greatest hope actually is that you will, in your own interests, will have, something will have occurred to you that has never occurred to me, and you will take your own interaction with this subject in directions that I can't possibly imagine. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant, Tobias. Many thanks. Really inspiring lecture, and fascinating also at the same time to watch the chat unfolding with people from all over the world. I saw India popping up, Portugal, the States, and interacting actually. So I don't think we have ever had so many experts from different parts of the world at a talk for Oxford Medieval Studies. So thanks to you, Tobias. I'll hand over for the discussion to my colleague, Professor Francis Lannigan. He will be picking up questions from the chat. So you're welcome to continue putting questions into that chat box. Also, Dr. Carl Kinsella is going to report from questions that might have come in via the Twitter feed. If you want to continue tweeting about that, and if you want to know more about the whole program, then go to our website on Torch. But now over to you, Francis.
Thank you, Henrika, and thank you, Tobias, for a really, really fascinating lecture. And we've had hundreds of questions coming through during your talk, so we're just going to go straight into those. So we've got lots to get through. There was so much to think about there. And to start with, we go right back to the beginning of your talk and to your moment of glory in Leicester with the procession, the reburial of Richard III. One of the first questions we had was, have you ever had a similar reaction to that member of the public in tears on any other occasion when you've been wearing armor that you might like to tell us about?
No. I mean, when you're in armor, it has this effect on you. You know, it kind of focuses the mind, and you don't really generally get very emotional in armor. I don't really. The one time I guess I did sort of have a kind of transcendental experience, if you want to call it that, was the first time I went to the Real Armeria in Madrid. That's a really extraordinary place. It has most of the personal armors made for the Emperor Charles V and his son King Philip II of Spain in the 16th century. But it's almost an entire royal collection displayed in a single gigantic room. And it's just very overpowering and very impressive. And it's one of those moments that where you don't know whether to cry or to write a poem, or you feel like you need to sit down, certainly. The only other time I can think of having a feeling like that is in the cathedral at Reims, actually, in France. A very similar kind of feeling, but most of the time I'm in armor and sort of too busy to admire the appearance of my colleagues, if you see what I mean. But sometimes you do. Sometimes there are little snapshot moments where things get burned into your memory. But I was just so worried about something bad happening at the reburial procession. I wasn't thinking about anything else except making sure my horse didn't step on anybody.
So the animal symbolism that you talked about has got a lot of comments here. And one question was, do any contemporary writers comment on the adoption of animal symbolism or animal armor? Are there any documents?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, that's something you could pursue for years and years and years. I mean, I'm not, this isn't really original exactly. I'm trying to pull various things together to make my own specific point, but the power of animal symbolism, of course, is well known and explored in all kinds of ways. And medieval literature routinely refers to individuals as lions, the lion of this or that, or the bear, the boar. It's a common, way of describing a hero, because you evoke the power of that animal, and you've achieved very efficiently your purpose. One of my favorite examples, incidentally, is again, as a person who spends more time these days in the Renaissance, is Orlando Furioso, Ludovico Ariosto's epic poem of the early 16th century. There's a lot of animal qualities in various characters in that epic. For example, Rhodomont, a warrior who has invulnerability conferred on him by his armor, which is made out of the skin of a dragon. There's a lot of that kind of thing. You could, if you won't go to look for it, I'm sure it's there.
I think, Carl, we have a question from Twitter. Carl.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tobias. We had a question, I think, that was echoed in the chat as well on YouTube, about suggesting that there was a distinct lack of evidence on Portuguese examples of armor, and people were just wondering about where you got that information from and what type of sources are available for Portugal.
Portugal.
Mm.
Well, I haven't spent too much working on that, but I know there are people doing that. I mean, there are the medieval histories of the kings of Portugal. There's some funerary sculpture surviving. There's a fair amount of depiction of armored warriors, if you care to look for it. You have to look on both sides of the border. Of course, they're very closely related to what's going on in Castile and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So going back to the dragon armor, actually, there were several questions about that. Could you say something about the provenance of the dragon armor, the picture that you showed? And is there any more of it that we could see?
No. This is the thing. Often, as an armor curator, you've kind of got to get used to disappointment. There are all kinds of tantalizing fragments like this that ended up, however, on the Paris art market in the middle of the 19th century, and then make their way into these Victorian collections. In the case of the Wallace visor, that's it. Nothing else of that survives. There are other dragon pieces of that period, or other pieces made in that style that can start to flesh out our picture of what an armor like that might have looked like. But they're not the same armor. There's the Negroli dragon armor made for Guidobaldo della Rovere in the 1530s. Part of that is now in the Hermitage in Russia. Part of it is in the Bargello in Florence. There are portraits of it, but that was only ever a parade armor that is really a half armor, vaguely analogous to a light cavalry armor of that period. It wasn't a complete armor for a heavy cavalryman, ever. Whereas this visor is a heavy cavalry visor. So it's a different typology. This was a head to foot dragon armor, but what it really looked like is left to your imagination. Yeah, sometimes it drives you crazy, but there are things you'll never know. But that's what keeps us going. Then one day a portrait turns up and you realize there's a portrait of a guy wearing that armor. That actually happened very recently in the case of another fragment of another similar armor, where only the helmet survives. And then only in the last couple of months, a portrait of the whole thing, the horse armor, everything appears. It can happen. And so when you're studying armor, there's always the sense that there are new things to be found and new things to be discovered. That's part of what I like about working in it.
Thank you. And we've had a lot of observations and questions about regionalism and the provenance of armor.
Yeah.
One question was, is there any evidence for a native German armor being made in the Italian style as opposed to being imported? Is that something that there's evidence for?
Ooh, that's. I think I've gotten that question before. That sounds vaguely familiar, and I think I had to say I had no idea the last time it was asked. I mean, the German lands is a huge area, and there were armorers active all over the empire. And, the subject of German armor is a huge subject. I would never dream of writing a book called Armor of the German Knight. You can forget that. It's too big. And you'd need a consortium of specialists to spend years working on that. And I suspect that there were a lot of regional styles within the German lands that were recognized at the time, but that we don't necessarily know so much about now. We might find out with more research that there is actually a Franconian style, a Bavarian style, a North German style. This is probably the case. The Germans were perfectly aware of Italian technology. And there are examples in the 15th century, I've come across the documents of German noblemen commissioning armors in Milan and having them sent. I've never seen anything expressly where you can point to a specifically German craftsman working in the unadulterated Italian style. There would be no reason for them to do that, really. Italian armors are easy to get. They're being imported by the thousands all over the place. It's not in a foreign craftsman's interest to make an Italian armor. There are other niches to be had. And so the German might take ideas from the Italian style and then he might do his own thing with it. But it seems that you very rarely get someone working exclusively in a foreign style. There's always some level of interpretation and adoption going on. The English, in my own work, the English are perfectly aware of what the Italians are doing. Sometimes they're interested, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they'll take an Italian idea, but then do something very different with it. And a lot of the time they'll reject the Italian fashion and go quite a different way entirely.
Yeah, I mean, that really leads into the next question, in fact, which is, is there such a thing as a distinct English style, or is it all imported from Italy and Germany? It might be the same question
Yes. Well, yes, I think there was, and I'm still publishing my argument for the English style. You have to wait for book two, really. Book two is the culmination and really everything I have to say that I have left to say about English armor. And then book three is looking at the presence of continental armor in England and the English evidence for continental armor. So book three is important to the whole project, but book two is really is the meat of the whole English question. It's a very tricky thing. I would never for a moment be, I hope no one would ever mistake my work as an argument for national styles with very distinct modern national borders. Mm-hmm. It's not what I'm saying at all. But the fact is, people in different regions have different tastes, different identities, and different technical and military demands. And it's about regional variation, but all of the borders between those regions, those aesthetic regions, if you will, technological regions, it's all very blurry. And there's a lot of transference backwards and forwards, and everybody's aware of what everybody else is doing. So after a certain point, you can't always put your finger down and say that definitely is English and that definitely is French and that definitely is Flemish. You always have to give yourself a bit of fluidity. But even within that, there's still a lot we can say that hasn't been said yet, really.
And we had one very specific question about your trilogy of books. Volume 2 goes up to 1500, is that right?
That's right.
And volume 3, do you know the dates?
Yes, I do. It's not the 16th century and it's not the 14th century. I'm not ever going to touch that. It's too big. But book 3 is, it's called I'll just give you the title because I like titles that tell you what you need to know. It's called Armor of the English Knight, Continental Armor in England, 1435 to 1500. And that's what it's about. It's primarily Italian armor in an English context because the vast majority of the continental imports in the 15th century in England were Italian. I have a very, very small little afterword about German evidence in England for German armor, which is next to nothing, and a few other bits and pieces about Iberia. But really, it's my Italian armor book. As you know, again, I don't think I'm ever going to write Armor of the Italian Knight, but this is the book 3 here is as close as you're going to get to that.
Thank you. And we had quite a few questions as well about the effigies. And yes, we're talking towards the end of the lecture, and again some very specific questions about where we might find these effigies. And in Italy, for example, do we find documentation of effigies in northern Italy outside of those that are generally publicly known in museums and so on? And if so, where would we find them?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's very tricky. I mean, it's getting easier now because, the internet is an easy way for people to tell everyone what they've stumbled across and what they found. And I mean, it's the, online communication has really revolutionized the wide interest in armor and, everybody pooling their efforts. But, I started my work on effigies really pre-internet. And there was no list. There is no list of English effigies, or there wasn't at that time. Since then, members of the Church Monument Society, Mark Downing, for example, he's published a complete catalog of all military monuments in England. I just had to go through the literature, and every time I came across something I didn't think I knew before, I'd put it on my own list. And I missed some things. I still have a few effigies of lesser quality that I missed and I still haven't seen. But I got most of them, and it's enough to make the argument, I think. But that situation is going to be different everywhere. You know, the records of monuments in Italy are going to work differently than the records in Germany or in Iberia or wherever. You really have to be a scholar who's working in that country and is familiar with the resources of, you know, of the particular area. You know, I've collected my own references to Italian monuments just incidentally over the years, and there's a few books I know to go to, but it's not comprehensive. And I would ask, you know, Italian colleagues for their guidance, certainly. And there's plenty of people who are working on it in every country now. There's people on Facebook who will be able to tell you everything you want to know, I suppose.
Sticking with the Italian connection, could you say something about the influence that Byzantine relations on Italy might have had in this period? The works of Giotto, the Byzantine style, did that influence Armour in this period?
I haven't looked at that so much. I mean, Giotto himself generally is not interested in armor really at all, and you very rarely get it appearing in his work. I mean, the one area where it might matter, I mean, that I can think it would immediately matter that I would pursue, if it was me asking the question, is the earliest signs in medieval Europe for a sense of the antique, for a sense of what ancient Greek and Roman heroes should look like, as distinct from what we look like as medieval Europeans. You know, in the 13th or early 14th century, if a Netherlandish artist wants to paint a picture of the siege of Masada, he'd just show French knights with an SPQR banner, and he wouldn't be bothered. But you know, in the 1330s and 40s, first in Italy perhaps, and then increasingly elsewhere, you start to see depictions of knights or armored warriors that have a Roman or classical flavor to them, that are something different from the standard modern European. And you know, Byzantine arms and armor, current at that time, might very well have had an influence on that. I mean, I don't know a lot about it, but I have a sense that the Byzantines retained a very strong Roman aesthetic. And that would then feed back into a rediscovery of what we think ancient Romans should look like. And then that kind of accelerates in the second half of the 14th century. You know, and really gets going when people like Donatello are digging up actual Roman sculptures and studying them and then incorporating them into their work. And by the 15th century, you know, there's a very detailed awareness of what the ancient world looks like.
Thank you, Tobias. We have hundreds more questions, but we don't really have time to go through them all now. And we don't want to subject you to too many more questions, but I'll hand over to Henrika now for the last question, and then she'll wrap things up. But thank you so much for a really, really fascinating talk. We've all learned a huge amount, so thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Many thanks from me as well, for two things especially. First, for the Amazons.
I got them in there.
The real revelatory moment was for me when you showed the last effigy, because I'm working on Northern German convents, and there is a statue of St. Maurice, the patron saint of the convent at Ebsdorf.
Yes.
And he has something that is called the Mauritius-Schürze,
Yes.
the penny of St. Maurice.
Uh-huh.
And I only now realized that it's a circle.
Yeah.
That the nuns made for the wooden statue.
Oh, yeah.
So
Very
that's
interesting.
yeah. I'll have to connect these dots now.
Moritz or Maurice is a hugely important saint in the study of armor, of course.
Yeah.
He appears quite early, and generally the technical accuracy of his equipment, because he's a Roman soldier, and that military aspect is so important. You know, again and again, you encounter references to his depiction in the arms and armor literature. He's one of those figures that if he didn't exist, we would know very much less than we do.
Yeah. So the debate will hopefully go on. Tobias has very kindly offered actually to have a follow-up chat with the master students once they have put in their reports. If any of the others want to join in that conversation, send us an email. You can subscribe to our newsletter on the Torch page for Torch OXAC UK Medieval Studies. And so we run one public event per term. In the first term of the year, it's a roadshow where we introduce the whole interdisciplinary range from musicology right through to Arabic studies. In the second term, it's normally a more theoretical lecture. And in the third term, we have something where we get the materiality of the medieval world become visible as it was today. So keep in contact. We'll be delighted to see many of you again. And just to sound us off, I'll have another blast of the trumpet with many thanks to Tobias.
My pleasure. Thank you.